All solved?
We figured it out. I'm pleased to report.
Senate institutions back. We are gonna spend some time on a Capitol bill discussion with Nicholas Kramer. We've asked Nick to come in and to give us a rundown on the tax funds. And so we can better grasp that. And Nick, how are you?
Doing okay, Mr. Chair. How are you?
Oh, good.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me.
Well, thanks for having us. Just tell everybody who you are and tell us what we need to know.
Okay, for the record, Nick Kramer, Department of Finance and Management, becoming a frequent flyer down here. Happy to be. So, Mr. Chair, I defer to you if there are specific elements of the cash fund you want me to get into, or if I should just start with an overview and kind of.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, start with an overview. Maybe we might interrupt you. We're gonna ask some questions and don't assume that we know anything. Just give it to us.
Okay, great. Well, I appreciate having the opportunity to spend a little bit more time. I think as we probably touched on a number of times, this is complex stuff or potentially complex stuff. We actually don't see the proposal is terribly complex, but there's a lot of moving pieces and lots that's happened. So I think it's great to have a chance to clarify. And again, apologies if any of this is redundant based on prior presentations.
We don't hear it.
But I'll kind of pitch it again. So at the highest level, the problem that the state is facing currently is the following, which is we are a small state with not many people and limited revenues. And so as everybody in this committee knows, whenever you look at anything per capita, we tend to skew fairly dramatically in one direction because we don't have very many capita. So for one thing, for instance, that debt rating agencies, credit rating agencies look very closely at is your debt per capita. And a number of other debt metrics, debt as your overall debt as a ratio to your appropriations, your reserves. There's all kinds of different things that they look at to give you a score, like a credit score, to say how trustworthy the state is. And that in turn, that rating that we get impacts a number of things. It impacts the state's interest that we're able to get on our general obligation bonds, which given the size of those translates to millions and millions of dollars in interest. It also impacts local municipalities and any political subunit of the state that has moral obligation associated, or that the state has moral obligation for their credit worthiness. So if the state's credit rating goes up, if the city of Rutland decides to go out and issue and passes a bond through a municipal bond vote and goes through the bond bank, their rate is impacted by the state's credit.
Oh, okay.
And so that I think is an important thing. It's not just the entity, the state of Vermont, that we care obviously strongly about, the Department of Finance and Management. There's trickle down effects to our whole public sector economy based on the state's credit score. So based on that, you can see why that's been a sort of critical focus for the administration, for any treasurer, any sitting treasurer, regardless of political party. This is sort of what we feel to be a nonpartisan issue that the state needs and should and has been and continues to make every effort we can to improve the state's credit rating, to try to get us to AAA. We were a AAA state at one point. We have dropped, I forget, sometime in the last decade down to the next, like an A minus, basically. If AAA is an A, we're now at an A minus. And one of the things, there's a lot, like I said, that goes into that rating. Some of which is within the state's control, some of which is is not directly within our control. Our demographics are continually cited as a challenge. The fact that we have an aging demographic, a shrinking tax base, polarization of taxpayers, things like that are, the work of this building collectively to try to address, but not something you can like pull a lever in a given year. What we can affect is our overall. There's a couple things we can affect, but one of the best levers we have to pull is our overall level of borrowing. So if we lower our general obligation debt, that impacts our credit rating favorably. And with that in mind, there's a long history that I won't get into of the inception of the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee, or CDAC, which we've mentioned several times, which is that independent body comprised of representatives from the administration, the treasurer's office, the joint assembly, that looks with just a fiscal lens at how much debt can the state afford. And so they have in recent years been recommending, after a peak in, I think it was 2013, 2014, just about, where we were issuing over $100 million in debt every year. We have been on a downward trajectory since then in the context of trying to improve our credit rating and also reduce interest payments. I mean, it's a significant annual draw on the state budget. Our debt service is a non-discretionary expense. We statutorily have to pay that. So appropriators across the hall don't have any debate every year about the debt service line. It's an obligation the state has made, we have to pay it. So I think that's the important context to frame this whole proposal in, right? Is that we have been lowering the amount of state debt. We need to continue doing that. We've been making good progress. We keep getting we just went out to bond this summer. We got a credit update from all three rating agencies. They continue to cite, they have a list of, here's things that the state is doing really well, thumbs up. Here's things that are pause for concern. And they explicitly, some of them list, here are things that if they happened could lead to a downgrade. And one of them is increased borrowing, right? So this is continually on their radar and therefore on all of our radar to continue.
So Nick, I'm just trying to follow logically. We were at the height of our borrowing in 13, 14, I think you said.
Somewhere thereabouts.
And in 22 was when the cash fund was first thought about and finally passed by the General Assembly, which is, I assume, a tool to reduce the amount of general obligation borrowing,
right?
Thereby improving our credit rating. And I understand that. What did we do between 2013 and 2022 we didn't have this tool yet? Did we just borrow less?
Exactly, Senator. So if you look at, and the CDAC reports every year have some historical data, it wasn't an immediate fall from 2013 to 2014. It's a gradual biennial decrease. So they did a little less the next year, a little less, a little less. And I think the cash fund, I mean, it predates, to be transparent, my time in the administration was my predecessor and the treasurer that worked a lot on it. It may have been an idea in the works for a while before it was sort of officially birthed into this building and this discussion. I think the answer is that the capital bills in those years continued to shrink in accordance with the CDAC recommendation, because this body has never.
And the need still kept on climbing.
Exactly. So I think you both are going where I'm hoping to go next, which is the whole idea of the cash fund proposed originally in FY22 is even more pressing now. If this trend continues of lowering borrowing, there's just less and less money to fund our capital expenditures, right? Since Vermont's capital bill is traditionally funded only by debt. So the idea being the cash fund is kind of the capital bill. It's our best answer to the problem of how do you continue to invest in the needed capital investments the state has. We know, everybody in this room knows costs are going up. The number of really big projects in the pipeline is growing, the Women's Correctional Facility and others that are big ticket items we're going to have to fund. How do you reconcile those two things if you have less and less bonding authority to do that? So the cash fund came out as a proposal of saying, look, we know that we have capital needs that are going up. Our bonding, we have to keep the course on bonding. So we need to come up with something that will, effectively make up the difference. And so the cash fund, the way the administration's proposal is structured is presumably if you are lowering your bonding every year over time, that will result in lower debt service costs, right? So we looked historically at, well, to my point earlier about the debt service being a non-discretionary item in the budget, we looked at how much of the general fund budget are we paying towards debt service, period. And it varied year over year, but it was somewhere, it's gone up, it's gone down, but it was generally above 4%. And only recently, in the last decade, since we've started to lower, has it climbed to 4% and then slightly below 4%. And I think a couple of years ago was that crossover point. And so our thinking was, well, look, if we historically have been obligated to pay 4% of the general fund budget towards capital projects generally in the form of debt service, let's lock ourselves in at that number. And as the actual debt service continues to go down, we take that difference between 4% of the general fund appropriations and the actual debt service, and we funnel that into this cash fund, which can then be used for direct capital appropriations. And so that's every time we talk about the 4% transfer mechanism, which if you just read the words quickly, sounds sort of complicated. That's really all it's saying. You take 4% of the last completed fiscal year, and that's just so that we have a good snapshot. There's no adjustments. We know what that number is. 4% of the last completed fiscal year, general fund appropriations, you subtract the current debt service estimate, and that difference, whatever's left, you sweep into the cash fund. So pause there if there's.
This is good, thank you, and we have talked about this, and I think it makes perfect sense. Now, can you ever, did you consider taking the 4% from the previous year unexpended and unencumbered, the fund balance?
So, yes, there's.
Or take it at the end of the year?
Just whatever.
Because then it might be more, it might be 5 or 6.
Right, so you're saying whatever we like do a budget to actuals comparison and see what's left over.
Yeah,
So I think if you were to look at, I mean, I off the top of my head, I don't have a like data informed precise answer to that. I think if you were to look at the reallocations section of the capital bill, what you're proposing is sort of a zero sum. So like
like a sweep of the previous year.
yeah, so with bonded dollar appropriations, there's. I think I've spoken about this before. What you are authorizing is spending authority for projects to be reimbursed by bonding. So
Oh, yes.
only when projects go forward and expenditures are made, then the state goes out to issue bonds to reimburse those expenses later. The unexpended, unobligated that you're talking about, we don't actually have cash. We don't go out to bond in the amount that this committee appropriates, we go out to bond actual expenditures. So we don't garner any cash. And then the reallocation section takes the spending authority authorized that wasn't used and diverts it to new projects. So there's no actual cash that we.
So do you have that in a graph over time?
Of the reallocations?
Yeah, and just the projects, just like some sort of history of
I think
the
not.
it would just be really.
Short answer, not handily. I think we could probably produce something. I mean, there's a number of different, a given capital bill has 60 different projects in it, and those vary year to year. So there's a lot of different data points. If there's a particular, are you looking
Well,
like
I don't mind that line of questioning, and I don't, but I wanna stick closer to what we're doing right now. I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to get it to historic and all of that to give us a general idea. I don't wanna go into debate. I just don't have the
No.
capacity to debate right now as far as what that number is or where it needs to be. I just wanna stick to the actual numbers. So
Yeah.
my next question I wanna get to is, let's break down 25, what we are doing right now, what we're actually bonding right now, and what we're actually doing for the tax fund. And I don't mind going back to that, but I just wanna stay really, really focused on the budget that we have in front of us.
I was just gonna wrap it up and say, if there's a way to look at the historical patterns that's useful to you, not just to us, that's what I would appreciate seeing.
Sure, and maybe we could follow up offline
Okay.
later to talk more about reallocation.
Okay.
How it's looked throughout
Great.
history.
So in line with the chair's intent, and I think I'm okay with this. How often and who, is it DFM, is it CDAC, who takes a look at that 4% and decides that it's not 4 anymore, and for the next fiscal year?
Well, so this proposal is relatively new, right? This is the
Yeah, it's
proposal we put
22, yeah.
forward in 22. We are feeling, I mean, to your point, the General Assembly, the administration, there could be an opportunity for reassessment at some point. I think we're feeling like, look, historically, this is where
Okay.
we've been,
You already answered.
and this is, I think, the benchmark to stick
Okay, so
to.
4%.
It's an amount in prior year budgets that we've had to pay. This would, 4% would, in other words, wasn't arbitrarily chosen. We took a really close look at history and we looked at moving forward, if debt service continues to decline, what will like be a number that gives us a really robust
Yes.
cash fund?
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, so let's break down 25. Let's break down 25, and then we're gonna get into at some point in time, Nick. We're gonna get into the dollars that are in sub accounts sitting across the hallway. And, you know, talking about that, and but I'm sure we're gonna get it as long as we start breaking down 25.
Sure.
So we'll get there.
So I think what I'd like to do, Mr. Chair, if it's okay with you, is flip to the cash fund crosswalk section.
Yep.
And I'll just make one more sort of high level point. I think it's
Yep.
really critical, and I don't want to forget it, which is to thinking about the cash fund and sort of the high level, why are we doing this? I think it's, and the 4%, it's important to note, if for whatever reason, we decide to completely ignore the cash fund and not utilize it as a capital funding mechanism, really there's two options. One, we stay the current course in terms of decreasing general obligation debt. And then the capital bill becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, and we have a much harder time keeping up with our deferred maintenance and all of our needs. So that's obviously a bad outcome. Or the opposite is we start to borrow more money again. And then we have a host of bad outcomes with the rating agencies, right? So we really see this as like the best defense against those two not great outcomes. If we do start borrowing more money again, just this, and I think this is an important thing to underscore for this committee, for colleagues across the hall, that debt service amount, that 4% will go back up, right? If we start borrowing more money. And like I said, right now 3 times, it's a non-discretionary expense. So this idea of like, oh, well, we're taking general fund dollars and moving them to the capital bill, that we've been taking general fund dollars and towards the capital bill always, just in the form of debt service. What the cash fund proposal says is let's capture a growing delta, lock in at 4%, not go back above it, and actually leverage those dollars for investment upfront rather than paying interest costs. So I think that's like the final sort of round piece of the high level argument is, look, we're gonna probably pay 4% anyways. Let's at least get the best value for Vermont taxpayers, right? We do that. So with that, I'll transition to the specifics of the cash fund this year. So in that section, the cash fund crosswalk starts with this probably more detail than folks would like to see, but I really wanted to be thorough with this. A lot of the first part, the history is stuff that I just went over. I'm gonna skip down. Would it be helpful to do kind of a recap of last year and the cash fund, or Mr. Chair?
Maybe it might only to the fact that, yes, for the committee to remember where it was, and then because we are gonna talk about some of the monies that got captured across the hall.
Yep.
And what we're gonna try to capture back, so yes, please, committee,
Yes,
okay,
thank you.
thank you.
So, and maybe I won't spend too much time in the sub accounts, only to say.
And I want, sorry, Nick, I want you guys jumping in as far as, don't look at me, just jump in as far as if you got a question, like fresh in your brain, and let's kind of flesh this out.
Okay, so notwithstanding the separate sub accounts, which we can revisit later, I'll just say, and I'll say this again and again, I mean, the administration's primary interest is in the first, what turned out to be this first sub account. That's the original proposal we put forward. That's the capital piece. That's in the FY25 budget. We are only touching the first sub account, right? The second sub account, which we talk about later, is sort of a different beast. So last year in FY24, if you do the 4% transfer calculations, we take 4% of FY22 appropriations less the current amount of debt service. That number came out to be, it was actually about 17.9 million. But the way things work in the building, things changed. In the final legislative construct, that number got slightly reduced to 17.685 million. So that 17.685 million that's in the middle of this page, that was the cash fund transfer as we originally contemplated it. There were some additional projects that then, got set into the other sub account. We can come back to that later. But so that was FY24. That funded 18 capital projects. The authorizations for these projects were made in the capital bill in Act 69. But after a healthy amount of legislative debate about it, the actual appropriations were made in the operating budget. So I'll come back to that, but just mentioning the distinction.
And that's 23, so that's before
That's
us.
It's confusing, Senator. So 2023 Act 69 is actually FY 24-25 capital bill.
Oh,
So
okay,
you
so
get that.
that
So
is
you-
all
So
up.
you did that,
Got it.
Sam, so that,
Okay.
you were part of that.
This is
Got it.
last year.
Alright,
So yeah, anytime you see just a full year that doesn't say FY, generally that's talking about a future cycle, just because of the nature of
okay,
the session happens in FY, like currently in FY 24, we are talking about the FY 25 budget.
right,
Next year, we'll be talking about the FY 26-27 capital bill, even though it's 25. So
Okay.
it's a little,
So we authorized it in the capital bill, but they appropriated it last fall.
okay, great, thanks.
so, and then I'm not gonna get into some of the meat here right away, but there were some projects that weren't in the capital bill that were funded out of the cash fund that
Yeah.
were also in the big.
Yeah, the 3.5 of the garage, we did a paving project, we did some stuff, okay, yeah.
And some of those, and most of those were actually out of the second sub account, and I'll come back to that later.
Okay,
But some of those were capital projects in nature, like when you look at the type of expenditure, and some weren't. So part of what we tried to do in the GovRec capital BAA is disentangle all that and say, look, anything that's a capital project, we're gonna put that in the capital book. That seems to make sense, right? Anything that's not, there's some grants to DMH and stuff that were at the second sub account, we'll leave that in the operating budget, because those are a different kind of plan. But so for FY 25, this is where we are now. There's a couple things, well, so first off, I'll just talk about the funding transfer and that calculation. So if you do that exact same calculation of 4% of, in this case, FY 23 general fund appropriations minus the current debt service estimates, the amount to transfer that you come up with is about 10.6 million. It's 10,688,747, and that's towards the bottom of the second page here underneath that chart. We also, and this is going back in history a little bit, when the cash fund was first proposed, there was a lot of surplus money that year, and $25 million was stuck in the cash fund as sort of an initial capitalization. So that money's been sitting there in the fund. That actually got moved over to the second sub account last year and is part of the reserve for AFT and A&R. But the upshot was that in FY 23, we had a lot of money in the account, in the fund. And so the fund accrued quite a bit of interest, which is $873,000. That is unlikely based on the current practice of spending all the cash fund every year to continue, right? That's sort of one-time money, but that's significant money because we had that 25 million there. So if you add 10.6, which is the cash fund transfer in FY 25, plus the 873,000, you get about 11.5 million, 11,562,026. So that is the current kind of total cash fund available that we are recommending in FY 25. So,
but that's being held in another account. We're asking for that to come back into the capital fund.
so the mechanism, Mr. Chair, is that annually we should transfer this amount, the 4% transfer from the general fund to the cash fund, and that every year should be the construct. That's our recommendation. And that got codified last year, I'd say 90% codified. With a caveat that the last 10% is sort of important. So we were recommending that this thing happen every year, that this should just be something we don't think about, right? This transfer mechanism happens, we're paying 4%, we should keep paying 4%, let's just do it. That was our recommendation. The final language that was passed in the big bill last year says up to 4% shall be transferred, which means that there's a considerable amount of leeway. It could be 0%, right? It could be 1%. So it's really left up to the jurisdiction of the General Assembly to decide, well, this is a tight year, maybe we don't do the full 4%. And we think, we get it, right? We're the office that tries to write the first crack at a balanced budget. It's hard to find money for things. We feel like, given the interest savings at play here, this is really and truly one of the best possible uses of state funds, right? So we're saying, no, we should commit ourselves to this transfer, not have it be discretionary, not have it vary year to year, depending on whether it's a good year or bad year. So you'll see in this year's capital BAA, we're actually proposing language adjustment that would strike the up to language, just saying, look, let's lock ourselves into this. I'll note that if the legislature is the legislature, right? So if things were crazy, it got really bad, this body has the power to not withstand any piece of legislation, right? So it's not like you're actually ever locked in 100 or 100%. We're just thinking, look, let's establish the norm that this is what we do. Let's not think about it. Let's get used to doing this. And if things were really crazy, we have ways out, right? But let's go this course. So that's one component of our current recommendation that shows up in the language section. And I can spend more time there later if helpful, but I think if it works for the committee, I'll just keep going with
Yep.
this or
Committee, good?
numbers.
Okay.
Construct. Okay, so like I was saying, so there's 11.5 in current cash fund available in FY 25 between the interest and the transfer. The big glaring elephant in the room, or in this case, not in the room, is the fact that in the capital bill last year, there are $10 million worth of projects that are authorized, contemplated for FY 25 from the cash fund, for which there is language in the capital bill that says, look, here's 10 projects worth $10 million. It is our intent that in the FY 24 operating budget, so last year's big bill, we set aside the funds to fund these. That may have been the intent on one side of the hall and not the other. It may have been in both sides of the hall, but then things change at the last minute because the appropriations are in the big bill, in the committee of conference and subsequent conversations. If that $10 million did exist in the construct in the operating budget, it did not make the final cut. The balance of the cash fund got swept and transferred elsewhere in sort of supplemental legislation, the Act 81, which had to deal with the homelessness challenge and the emergency housing. And so there was a big chunk of the cash fund, about 23 million actually, that went to funding programs in AHS at the end of last legislative session. So the upshot is that those $10 million that it seems, based on legislative language, were contemplated as being set aside in the FY 24 budget were not. So if we want to fund these 10 projects, we got to come up with that money, right? Well, conveniently, we have 11.5 million in new cash fund revenue according to this transfer, but that's the lion's share, right? If you're backfilling $10 million of projects, there's only 1.5 million left over for new stuff, which is what is reflected in our governor's recommend capital BAA. We are backfilling fully those $10 million of projects using current cash fund revenue. And then there's about 1.5 million left over, which we are allocating, I think, 1 million of it towards, I don't have it in front of me, I think it's VGS. It's
Barry McFarland building.
Barry McFarland, that's right there. And then 500, the remaining 562,000 is funding a portion of the DOC HVAC upgrade work. So not exactly an all-you-can-eat buffet in terms of cash fund use this year, right? And that dynamic is part of what we're trying to avoid moving forward. And one of the reasons that we're proposing to move the capital projects from the operating budget back into the capital bill, our thinking being if they're in the capital bill, then when the capital bill passes, which is before the operating budget, by the way, that was another challenge, was that since a big chunk of capital projects were carried in another piece of legislation that didn't pass in this case until late June, state entities were sort of twiddling their thumbs for those 2 or 3 months, not able to get money out the door, which in Vermont's construction season, you want to be able to do as soon as possible, but they're waiting for this piece of legislation to pass. So that was another problem, right? So there's different timing of the two bills. There's uncertainty introduced based on, anything can happen in committee of conference with regards to the operating budget. So our whole concept is that by pulling the appropriations back into the capital appropriations back into the capital bill, that would provide this committee and your House counterparts the authority that you need to really be able to craft a holistic capital budget, right? Where a project might have funding from bonded dollar appropriations and it might have funding from cash fund. And those two might work together to holistically move the project forward. But if one significant chunk of that is held up in another bill and is on another time frame, that's really challenging both for this committee and passing your own bill. You don't know. I mean, you could see, just to sort of run the thought experiment, if you have a high priority project that you really want to move forward, are you going to be comfortable cash funding it if you know that there's, well, it's in the other bill, so who knows whether it's actually going to happen or not, right? So by replacing the appropriations in the capital bill, what we're really trying to do is give these two committees the authority to decide how they're spent. And the appropriations committees will always retain authority of that transfer. That transfer will occur in the big bill. Like I said, extraordinary circumstances they could not withstand. There's options for discussion or debate, but we think that faucet should sort of be set on autopilot. Those funds should flow here, and these committees should decide how they're spent, just like any other capital appropriation that would be funded by bonded dollars.
So fund day, right? We're looking at fund day.
That's exactly right.
So
Cash funding.
what happens if they say no?
Right. So I think the point, as I said earlier, Mr. Chair, we've been trying to stress is, okay, if you say no, you're doing one of two things. You are tacitly supporting kind of the capital bill becoming more and more anemic, right? Over the long term, I guess I'll respond in the long term, right? The bonding authorizations are going down. We have the increase in capital costs. So if anyone does not support the cash fund, I think it's fair to say, well, what's your alternative proposal to continue funding the capital bill? And if the answer is, well, there is none, then let's be honest about the ramifications of that for state infrastructure, right? We've got lots and lots of deferred maintenance. We every year, having just gone through this process, I mean, I can avow to how much need there is out there from departments that we hear about that we just can't fund, right? Because we don't have money for it. So I think the CAT fund is in that vein critical. I think there's some serious misconceptions about, one thing I've heard a lot in the building is, oh, well, the cash fund, it's just GF. It's just GF that's being laundered, general fund that's being laundered through this other fund. I mean, if you want to look at it like that, there's plenty of uses of where.
Well, certainly how they treated it, right?
We have other examples of general fund being used to transfer to other funds. I mean, the state's revenues, the state's like any business in some ways, right? We have all these different revenue streams that we're trying to balance. Transportation fund right now is in hard times, right? Because their revenue streams are low.
Yep.
If you look at just the three major funds, the ed fund, the transportation fund, and the general fund, going back 10, 20 years, there's plenty of historical precedent for major transfers, even on an annual basis, between the funds based on which one is doing well. At one point, the transportation fund was booming, and we were sending money from the transportation fund to the general fund to help support the general fund, which was in harder straits. Then the shoes were reversed, right? And on the other foot, and we sent general fund back to the transportation fund. And there's dynamics like that play out pretty frequently. This, by contrast, there is no funding source for the cash fund. We're saying, here is this capital. Really, it's a tool, a mechanism to continue funding our capital budget the way we need to, that locks in a ratio that we are very familiar with and very comfortable with, and just automatically scoops a certain portion of that general fund. It's similar but different. There's a number of reserves in the general fund, right? The general fund stabilization reserve, the rainy day fund. The stabilization reserve, I think it is, has a 5% statutory maximum, which we fully fund basically de facto every year because we want to be in good standing with the rating agencies. And that amount, just every year we figure, okay, well, general fund appropriations are here, there's 5% that we have to put aside in the reserve, and we just do that kind of automatically as part of our construct. So this is sort of similar in what we're proposing, at least, that we would think. I wish I had like a better ace in the hole answer if somebody says, yeah, we don't want to do it. I mean, I think the best thing to do is respond and kind of make clear what the ramifications are for not doing that.
Yes.
So to follow up the chair's question, I heard one option. I think you said there were two, but I didn't hear the second one. Maybe I'll suggest it. And I'm saying it's probably just as not palatable or satisfying. But if you take the 10 projects or however many there were, the 10 million.
Right.
And you don't do them.
Yeah.
You haven't increased your debt at all because you're not borrowing to do anything.
Right.
But what does that do? Does that increase the deferred maintenance cost later on, which is also not a good idea? But I'm just sort of trying to understand where we are.
I think you hit the nail on the head, Senator. I mean, I would invite BGS back in as the real subject matter experts on this, but you know, to use a pretty digestible example, say you discover one day that you have a patch, your roof needs a little patch, right? There's water leaking through getting into your attic. And you decide, "Oh, I'm not gonna fund that this year.
Yeah, you just buy another bucket rather than fix the roof.
Yeah, or maybe you don't even have money for the buckets, I'll just let it drip, it doesn't seem like it's a big deal, next thing you know, you got mold, right? And what was a $20 tube of roof sealant is now a full mold remediation in your, and I think that's pretty comparable to a lot of these things, I mean, it'll vary project by project. But at a high level, I think that's the situation that the state is facing, right? We have a lot of capital assets. They age, they get older.
Mhm.
Many of them are already way beyond their sort of typical usable lifespan, right? And we're thrifty Vermonters, we get due, we duct tape a lot of things together and keep things going. There's only so long that you can really effectively do that though, before things really, the holes in the roof are adding up and you're looking at a puddle of water on the floor and getting things. So that's, I think, part of why we're feeling like this is really important. Plus, not to mention if at the same time, just to stick with my metaphor there, say that you've got your family's growing, you've got a baby on the way, a mother-in-law coming, and you're looking around space, and you're like, well, you're gonna have to build an addition on your house, and that's gonna be a $50,000 project. All of that, that's like we know that we've the work of this committee, right? We need a new women's correctional facility. We are looking at significant things that are gonna cost a lot, that take multiple capital bills to fulfill. So you gotta start chipping away at it somehow.
Well, we better be good salespeople, I guess, huh?
Yeah.
Well, I think the administration certainly appreciates the support of this committee. I mean, and really appreciate the time to walk through this. We're certainly trying our best. Really no pride of ownership here either. I mean, this is our proposal, right? But really it's our proposal on behalf of taxpayers in the bottom line. We really don't feel like there's any political agenda buried here. There are undoubtedly things in this building that are political. This does not to us feel like one of them.
So let's flesh it out a little bit further. So appropriation says no. They just say no. And we have 10 projects that aren't gonna get done. That's just the way it is. So they're saying to the governor, you find the money in FY25 to do those projects. That's the gist of it.
Well, at this point, all right, so to your point, Mr. Chair, how this would unfold this session, for instance, the governor's recommended construct is that we do this. And you can believe that every cent of remaining general fund revenue has been, we've suggested a use for it somewhere.
Absolutely.
And that whole world of needs is equally under pressure and stuff. So if the legislature were to say, no, we're not gonna make the cash fund transfer, I mean, the first question I would ask just as a curious citizen is, okay, what are you using that 11 million for, right? And so then it becomes a pretty simple case of balancing priorities, right? And so you could ask for a list of what the okay, if the 11 million is not going to fund these long-term capital investments, what is it going to be funded? I will note that, there are different returns on investment for state dollars, right? And I think one of the reasons that we've been so emphatic about this and really pushing capital space is that these are really good long-term investments. You build a new X and that building may serve our generation, it might serve the next generation. It's investing in our kind of built infrastructure in a way that keeps giving back, right? There are critical things across state government that we need to fund, some of which do not have such a long-term return on investment. I think everybody in this room could probably think of some examples, but there is a case to be made. Well, okay, if you're not spending the 11 million here, what are you spending it on, and what benefit does that have over the long term? You know, is it investing versus spending, right? To borrow this term. So I think that would be the question I would ask. I think, you know, looking just at this list of the 10 million, right? You can see there are the Burlington Cherry Street is represented, Montpelier, Washington County Superior Courthouse, Rutland Field Station, Brandon, Newport, Montpelier. These are projects spread out all over the state, right? There are constituents that are probably pretty interested in these projects and seeing them fulfilled and get done. I think this is one snapshot this year, right? But the cash fund as a concept, that will only be more true, right? You talk to somebody who's a woman who's justice involved in Vermont and their experience in the current correctional facility in Chittenden. And I know members of this committee are intimately aware of that, right? If we decide, no, we're scrapping this whole cash fund idea, we're not gonna borrow any, it's gonna be very difficult to build a replacement.
So the folks that were maybe before with the Vermont Veterans Home looking for 1.5 million. And the way that it is right now in this act, of the 10 million that we're looking for, we've appropriated 1.5 million for them, for their designs and I think that for the committee is kind of valuable information that where they were asking in 1.5 million, well, the government has proposed 1.5 million for them, and it's in that gap fund.
So could you just clarify from Mr. Chair, which 1.5 million were they?
I think it's on the box on page I think
Yeah, you're right.
it's in this box right here. Yeah. I think
It's in the.
yeah, it's in here.
Right,
It's in the box that you have in there that basically outlines $10 million in need.
right,
And it's 18 D section 7.
right.
And that's the 1.5 million. They were in asking for 1.5 million for design work.
Right.
And so yeah, that would mean that they wouldn't get that money.
Perfect example, right? If this cash fund is not funded, if the appropriations committee say, nope, we're not doing it this year, that is one of 10 things that there wouldn't be any obvious funding for. So then you play the dominoes game and you go back through the list of bonded dollar appropriations and say, well, is there anything that we can reduce or not do completely? And then it just becomes this, unfortunately, that's the nature of this budgeting game that we play constantly, is we have all these really important things to do and only so much money to do it. So
I can imagine another potential suggestion, not necessarily from my quarter, but if you decide not to fund these, the governor's proposed this 3.57% increase, I think, in the budget from last year, something like that, I think it's 3.57, which is basically in line with inflation and all the other things. You could make a case, if you were willing to go beyond that 3.57, that you could find other revenue sources in the operating budget to fund these 10, but it would mean an increase in either fees or taxes somewhere along the line. There's no way that it couldn't mean that. And that might be an argument that other people would make. If they're that important, let's just find a new funding source. That's our favorite kind of throwaway line. Let's find another funding source. Well, what does that mean? That means you and me and you and me, we're all gonna pay more taxes or fees. There's no other way around it.
And I'm sure, Senator, a point that you're sympathetic to is that if this were the only thing, the only issue up for debate, okay, 10 million, right, but there's, I think,
Oh,
40 different things that fall into exactly that category. Well, we just find another funding source for this, and maybe incrementally, each little piece doesn't feel like a big thing, and then at the end of the year, the end of several years, we realize, whoa, we've increased the tax burden by X.
It's like-
In the context of the 18% property tax potential increase, right? There's lots going on in the revenue space this year. I think make that challenge, that conversation with the more challenging.
Proverbial duck biting your butt, and you don't feel it a lot, and then all of a sudden you realize it's quite a hole in it.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So, one other thing. A lot more things, but just a thought in my brain. Has the monies that are sitting in Fund A, has appropriation said, no, we're not funding those 10 projects?
I have not heard anything, Mr. Chair, to that effect. No, I have heard a number of oblique comments that, I hate to admit it, this stuff does keep me up nights sometimes, because I think it's a good idea. Certain committee members tend to speak with probably well-placed aura of uncertainty, knowing that there's all kinds of things up in the air and there's multiple competing perspectives. I haven't heard anything specifically suggesting.
So if they just said, no, we're just gonna keep it here, but we're gonna fund those projects, how does that set us?
So that's a good one to explore. I'm glad you asked that. So I think, frankly, I think that's a likely outcome. It's a possible outcome worth discussing. From our standpoint, it's definitely not desirable. I think probably if I were sitting in your collective chairs, it wouldn't be particularly desirable for me either. Because, as I pointed out, there's several things that happen. One, you being this committee do not have any authority or besides authorizing projects, which is essentially akin to legislative intent, saying we really want this to happen, but the final authority rests with the appropriations committee. So you're back in the same position you were last year, where you can pass a capital bill. This is an adjustment year, but the capital bill in those years typically passes even sooner than it does in the beginning of the biennium, right? So you could have a capital bill through here, maybe in April sometime, and all the bonded dollar projects are off to the races, right? Departments are able to go start spending that. Anything that would be reliant on cash fund appropriations is gonna have to wait through the appropriating process. That's, as I mentioned, that's valuable construction time in our short construction window that BGS and other entities are sitting waiting for a legislative outcome. That time is real in terms of the time value of money, that cost increases go up, you can't order certain parts, right? Again, BGS could testify in much more depth to any of that. But, so I think that's one challenge, and then there's also that level of uncertainty, right? Who's to say that there's not that, and I'm not.
No.
Ask aspersions on anybody, but hypothetically, say a message is received between committees that says, oh, yeah, we're gonna fund these, but we'll carry it in our bill. What if they don't then at the last minute, or we'll carry it and we carry it in contingency, and then things get swapped around? There's so many, it's such a more dynamic bill over there, I think, in a lot of ways, just because there are so many different inputs to it, that the likelihood of something like what happened last year happening again is a lot higher. So if I were institutions committee member, I mean, I would have a healthy degree, I think, of skepticism about, okay, like, if you're gonna keep it, you're gonna keep it, but we'll see what happens. And then in the meantime, there are these very real ramifications for state entities.
Yes.
So, just a question about these numbers are from last year's, for the existing budget.
Correct.
So some projects would likely have been impacted by the flooding and may require more money, may require less money if they were damaged and then fixed with FEMA money. So I think it would be helpful if we went through and got an update from BGS or whoever it would be on the current status of these projects. And so that's one thing, which I don't think it would be that hard, because most of it.
No, I think
BGS.
that would make good sense.
But the veterans home, so 1.5 million, so that's what they would expend, but then they expect to get 65% of that back. Is there a way?
Maybe.
Well, Yes, but they expect to. So is there a way to show that as a, like,
Recapture that
yeah,
somehow.
yeah,
So I, not being myself super familiar with the project or the funding structure, I mean, the question I would ask as well is it actual reimbursement to 65%, or is it match, or does the 1.5 million buy you 65 in additional investments that are going into the
the
project?
way that they described it, it would be a 65% of their costs would be paid by the federal government. They would get a federal grant
So 65% of the
of the 1.5.
million, so that's the total project.
But they don't know for sure, so it's not something that we could count on.
So in a contingent situation like that, okay, I suppose that makes sense why they're asking for this. I mean, that's pretty unusual circumstance for a capital project. I think if that were to come through, there's two things. One, if it happened before we went out to bond, it's possible that we would not bond for that
Mhm.
65% if they got the federal funding in hand. So you would see a lower bond issuance, and then that would show up in a future capital budget under the reallocation section of spending authority. So in short, yes, there would be an opportunity to recapture
Okay,
that amount.
and then the interest, I didn't hear you say that the interest was part of the original plan for the 4%.
So I think originally as we proposed the cash fund, well,
I mean, I think it's not unreasonable, but I'm just wondering if it's new.
we proposed the cash fund and we did, I can forward committee members a report that we submitted last year. Interest was included in sort of the grand plan of how we would use this. We were actually looking back on it, maybe somewhat naively thinking, well, what would be really great is if we could establish this cash fund, do these transfers and have a fund
Live on
balance
the
that
interest.
would accrue.
Well,
And yeah.
Yeah.
and over time, I mean, interest is unlikely to ever keep pace with the 4% transfer mechanism. That would really be the primary funding source, just the way the math works out. But if you have a large fund balance,
yeah,
it could become, I mean, look, 25 million in
Right.
the bank, you got 800,000.
right.
I think, frankly speaking, the dynamics of this building are such that that's a pretty unlikely path to have, say, $100 million sitting in a fund.
Yeah.
Great, we're getting interest every
Oh,
year.
yeah.
To not be able to use that, I think
Let's
this would be
dip
really hard,
in.
given all the really
No,
valid
I-
projects.
Social Security coming to mind?
No, I'd like to save it. So what do you do with the interest when you're with your other funds, the rainy day fund?
So the way that interest works in financial operations, with really the treasurer's office would be the best people to speak to this. All of these fund accounting is an accounting tool, right?
Sure.
Keep track of all our different buckets. The vast majority, with some exceptions, of the state's cash
Yes.
is invested in various vehicles, and there's policies according to the treasurer's office how we do that. So based on the interest received by that sort of giant pool of cash, that then gets reallocated to funds based on the fund balance.
Good.
So the general fund in particular, I mean, like you may remember, Senator, the treasurer recently came out with this program that allows him to invest a small portion in local municipal things. So
Yes.
there are all kinds of investment vehicles out there that the state generates a return on its assets on. And those all kind of blend together to come up with these interest numbers for the fund.
Right.
Does that answer
No,
the question?
well, sorry, we can still say.
Okay.
I would just like, I mean, there should be a number each year of the average amount
So
of
like in the
interest.
case of the general fund, the
Percentage.
interest is included in the consensus revenue forecast that the budget is based off.
Okay,
Right.
So our revenues include interest.
and
right?
so,
So this is similar to that, and if I had said earlier, we're discounting interest, that was a complete misspeak, because we are banking this 873. But I think what I was saying is, given the fact that we're starting to use a full fund balance, we're not going to have 25 million sitting on the bottom line. That number is gonna go way, way down, especially as interest rates start to see, it's not going to be as significant
No.
of a funding source.
and I totally understand. It's just that you might wanna include interest in the ongoing, calculation of what could be used.
So thanks for the clarification, transfer mechanism is one part of what's specified in statute,
Okay, so but it's just not in.
32 VSA 1001B,
Okay.
which talks about the cash fund. The transfer is codified, and then it does say interest accrues back to the fund. So any interest based on the fund balance remains in the fund.
Okay,
And we would propose it presumably for use.
yeah, and this is a good year to mention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't know, so we have things.
So. Nick, on, line 165. The 5.247839. What's that money? So help us with 2025. What we're spending on bonded dollars, what's the spend in 2025, FY25 of bonded dollars, and help us break that down.
So, thank you, Mr. Chair. So we are switching gears now from the cash fund side, so I'll put a fork in that to say 11.5 total in cash fund, right?
Yeah.
The CDAC authorization is given for 2 years, so that's that $108 million figure. That has not changed. They do revisit their recommendation mid-year. They have not, and they typically don't change that. It stays solid for the 2 fiscal years. So we don't have any additional bonding revenue from sort of base bonding authority to follow the CDAC recommendation. In capital budget adjustment years, the only additional bonded dollar authority can come from one of 2 places, really. One is reallocation, so that's that section 16 above, which I apologize, the section numbers are sort of hard to see going in green headers, but the section you're asking about, the 17, section 16 is all of the reallocations above, goes up to the previous page. So that's what Senator Harrison has asked about several times. We're constantly looking at projects, how much has gone out the door, what's left over. Are there projects that are coming in consistently under budget that we can reallocate prior bonding authority to other stuff? And that's what exists in section 16. You can see so in column F of the spreadsheet or column J, because those are really reflecting the same thing. In FY24, we made, this committee, I should say, and the House counterparts made $14.7 million in reallocations. So that was in addition to the 108 of new bonding authorized by CDAC. And so then that gives you that total of 122 million down below, total general obligation funds available. That's on line 168. This year, we are picking up an additional $2.1 million in reallocations. That's on line 161, highlighted in yellow and column K. That's just the sum of all the reallocations that we've identified this year that are additional projects that we just don't need those appropriations. So that number totals to 2.1 million. And then to your original question, Mr. Chair, line 165 is this line that says FY24 bond premium. And this is traditionally the other source of revenue in a capital budget adjustment year. And I think I've spoken to this before, but it's sort of a slippery concept. So I think probably helpful to go over again. So when we do go out to issue bonds, there are a number of reasons why the sale of bonds, if we say we're bonding for $100 million, there are a number of reasons, I think Senator Harrison asked about this earlier, for clarification, why investors might pay a premium. In other words, more than what the bonds are worth on their face value, their par, to either gain a better interest rate or depending on where the bonds sit, sort of in the projections of how the market's going to go. They're willing to pay this premium. So it's additional money above. It's not just, hey, we're borrowing $100 million, so pay us $100 million. They're saying, oh, we'll actually pay you $105 million, but you're gonna owe us more interest. Or we're gonna pay you $105 million because government bonds are a good investment right now, and it's worth it to us to do that, right? We're hedging that the rates are gonna go up or down. So.
And we love Vermont.
And we love Vermont. Actually, I think this is totally aside from what we're talking about. One thing I think is really cool about Vermont, the treasurer's office does a good job of this. There are multiple series for each of our insurances, and one of them are like what they call citizens bonds. And so anybody can go out and buy the minimum denomination. If
Yeah.
you're interested, you want to support Vermont locally, you can go out and put $1,000 towards, and you guys would know exactly.
Yeah, people
what
do that, and you get the paper too, I
Yeah,
think, don't you?
Yeah, so I think that's a really
Yeah.
cool thing that our state does. But so that premium, then what happens, say that, I'll stick with that, those easy numbers. Say we're going out to bond for $100 million of projects. They're saying, well, we would pay you 105 million based on all these factors. We don't say, great, thanks, here, and bank the 105. What we do is say, okay, we're gonna go out and bond for 95, and we're gonna take that 5 million of premium to fund the last little bit, right? Because we're 50, and this isn't just Vermont, right? This is common practice. So we're actually only bonding for some percentage less than 100% of our need, and then the premium is making up the difference. But if you think about, CDAC authorized us, let's say, to bond 100 million. So we only bonded 95 of that million. We actually only borrowed that much, and the rest was just premium, which funded these projects. So that $5 million difference is then kind of available for reallocation. That's prior year bonding authority that we never bonded for. So it's similar to a reallocation, but it gets kind of rolled into the bottom line. That's been the practice for a number of years in the capital. So the 2.1 plus the 5.2. So the 2.1 on line 159, 161, and then the 5.2 on line 165 and 166. Those two numbers add together to the 7.4, which is on line 167, I think, or 168. And that represents your total new bonding authority in FY20.
Added to the 108.
Added to the 108 and to the 14.7 million in reallocation, so it was 122. So this is now on lines 172 and 3. As of the construct last year, we were planning on bonding 122 million in FY24 and 66.2 in FY25, but now with the additional capacity, we're planning on bonding 73.6. And then that's 600.
I'm sorry, I'm not following. No,
That's because of the
just showing the
premium.
73.
With the premium number 165 then?
The premium around 165. So the premium and so the number that says total general obligation funds available on line 168, that's the total amount of new bonded dollar authority in FY25. And so if you add that to, it was cell G172 last year, which is what Act 69 contemplates spending or authorizing in FY25. And then you add 7.4 to that, you get roughly 73 million. The difference, I say roughly because there's 640,000 sitting on the bottom line. And there's an explanation behind that I can get into next if community members would like, but it just takes some explanation.
So total in FY24 and 25 of bonded dollars for our capital bill for the 2-year biennial bill was $130,210,095.
That's the total revenues available, Mr. Chair, yeah, and then the total spending that we're proposing is just under that, is 129,570,906, leaving 640 on the bottom line that we're not proposing a use for. And so that's up to your House counterparts and to you all to decide how to spend.
Okay.
There's some history to why that. Typically, we might not do that, but there was a late breaking request that caused us to go back and do kind of a reassessment of the reallocations list based on the latest information. This is like days before we submitted this to see if we could try to rustle up some money for a military project that I expect you'll hear more about later in the session. And then that we wound up funding that through another source, but we figured, hey, we found this money. Let's, full transparency. sure the legislature will find a good use for it.
Okay.
So,
Or save it.
So that way.
Wendy, did you say something conservative?
Yeah.
I'm fiscally concerned.
Yeah. So that will be a
the-
battle between the two committees, I can see that going on.
So the 130, I just wanna double check that, I
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah, please.
So the 130 million, that's our new.
132, 1095.
Yeah, as opposed to the 108.
right, so the 130, 210, 095 represents across both years of the biennium, the
Yeah.
total revenues.
Okay.
And full disclosure, I mean, we're looking at this sheet now today, January. By the time the draft capital bill reaches this committee, your House counterparts may have uncovered some additional revenue that will increase that amount slightly. And just to preempt anyone, what's like, the verb uncover sounds sort of problematic, like, oh, I went digging for it, and we found it. What really happens is a timing issue, right? When we prepare the capital budget, we have the most accurate information as of that day in terms of how projects are happening. And then by the time in February, a couple months later, that it's going through the Representative Amendments Committee, there's just more information available. So they work closely with VGS to find to say, okay, based on where we're at now, has anything changed? And often they'll say, oh yeah, since this last snapshot, these projects have moved forward and they were under funded. So there's more that we can reallocate there.
Yeah.
Little changes like that. So that's where that additional.
Maybe they can find 11 million, and they can fund it.
So,
You never know.
you could ask.
So, on page, I don't know what page it is, but it's line 78 through 87, the water, and this is what I've been wondering about these. So
78.
line 78,
Yeah.
77.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at the yellow.
Yeah.
So the first one, water quality grants, that looks like 550,000 will not be necessary, so it's proposed. Or it will not be necessary, 550 of the 2209, is it just,
So what's happening there is, so the 22,209, 119 is the FY 24 appropriation for. If you look at the first set of three columns there, that's the Act 69 has passed
Yes.
columns. You'll see that there's nothing in this section except for that $6 million clean water FY 225 request.
yes,
So, and that's typical because while this bill is prepared as a biennial bill, the Clean Water Board's budget, which includes funding sources that aren't just the capital bill, but the Clean Water Fund and other sources, they meet every year and they're on an annual budgeting cycle. So what typically has been done since the Clean Water Fund and Board was established is that in the first year of the biennium, we just put in a placeholder for the second year, with the acknowledgement that the Clean Water Board, which is a public body that has public meetings and takes input and it's a very engaged, dynamic process. And I'm happy to talk for a lot longer about if anybody who's interested, maybe offline. They gather all this feedback. There's many people that work on this and are really trying to drive us towards our clean water goals. So we just put in a placeholder for the first year with the acknowledgement that they'll make a recommendation on how to spend that placeholder, how to allocate it in the second fiscal year. So that's what's happening here. If you look at line 87, which has a $6 million placeholder, that gets zeroed out this
Yeah.
year. And then those amounts are reallocated in those four yellow lines.
so and the total still is
And
the
the
same,
total-
15,885.
Okay,
Exactly.
that's helpful.
Okay, that is helpful.
And I'll just highlight that originally that $6 million placeholder was $10 million
Right.
placeholder. But
Right.
what happened last year was in the shuffling of priorities, there was a decision made to take 4 million of that and repurpose it elsewhere in the capital bill. And then there's actually.
And they actually have enough funds within their board to make up that $4 million
Right.
and then leaving us with a 6. And so we still did the $10 million worth of water project.
Exactly, Mr. Chair. So this year, it just so happened fortuitously that the Clean Water Fund, which is that different funding source, has had, like many of our state funds, significant revenue upgrades in recent years. And because of the way they budget, those revenue upgrades, which are late breaking, fall to the bottom line, because they only budgeted so much, but they actually took in this money. So there's been this one-time surplus that was massive. Unfortunately, and I sit here before you today with the sad news that the trajectory on the Clean Water Fund has been going the other direction now. And the latest revenue upgrade actually saw a decrease. And so they're starting to have to, and they're a very cautious board, very fiscally prudent, and they've put some mechanisms in place so that they're okay. All that is to say that this one-time funding that they had 4 million in the Clean Water Fund that they could backfill this year, they've been very, very adamant about. It was really lucky that we have this
Right.
money, but it's really.
Right, and that's why we agreed to that though.
Right.
Right,
Exactly.
so that's why we agreed to it last year. And we struck a little fire in the pot and we were able to put that together.
Exactly.
Good, thank you.
Going back to the cash fund on Fund B.
Yes.
Is the administration okay with that? Leaving that money there?
So I'll back up a second to say, Mr. Chair, the governor's recommended capital bill, biennial capital bill that became Act 69 that we're talking about, had cash fund appropriations in cash fund A that we've been talking about all day, and then had what we were calling one-time general fund appropriations.
That was the original money that we put in there that was really never meant to leave that fund. It was meant to, correct me if I'm wrong, no, but it was meant to be the seed money that generated interest and that would occur.
So that's the 25 million actually going back another year.
Okay.
that's in there. So that's something else.
Okay.
On top of that, we were facing pretty unprecedented surpluses last year. We had a lot of general, I talked about striking while the iron's hot. We're thinking, well, what can we put this money towards good uses? Again, to the point that if you have a surplus in one fund, let's try to figure out across state government where we can use it. There was pretty significant money that we thought, well, we have the capital needs to the point about capital budget's been going down. Let's use general fund to fund those. So our proposal had, I think it was like 60 million or maybe 80. I would have it.
Yeah, it was higher than 60.
But it was, yeah, because I think 60 was what sugared off in the end, maybe. But we had a significant amount of one-time general fund we were proposing for capital.
Okay, so I think before it was all said and done, Nick, I think it was like 97 million, something like that, because I think we had 108 million in bonded dollars and we went all the way up to 203 million with the total for the 2-year biennium.
I think that's right, Mr. Chair. Yeah, your memory is better than mine on that one.
Surprising.
I think
Go with it.
that's exactly what happened. And the cash fund B, to be clear, was an idea incepted in this building by a number of legislators who thought, well, rather than have this cash fund proposal that the administration is that has been put forward, and then one-time general fund, let's have a second component of the cash fund that's not this transfer mechanism that we're talking about, but that can be, and this is, I'm paraphrasing, really, you'd have to talk to, this is my understanding of legislative intent, that can be kind of a holding tank for surplus dollars, right? And that if we have surplus money, we can put it in there and then use it as appropriate for capital projects or for other projects, right? And they use both. I think the creation of cash fund B is where things got really complicated last year, right? And where some of these pieces got lost in the shuffle, right? Because what you had 17.6 million in cash fund A, more or less the transfer mechanism we proposed. And then you had a number of projects that were capital in nature that were there was more to do than the 17.6, but so some of them got appropriated out of cash fund B. Then there were some projects that were not capital in nature that were appropriated at cash fund B. And if you look at the full name of I really prefer cash fund A, cash fund B for obvious reasons. The full name is like the other infrastructure and something, it's OIR is the acronym. but it's the R at the end stands for reserves, right? And one thing that was a high priority to the administration was that we set aside one-time available general fund surplus to fund these obligations that we know are coming down the pike in terms of the IIJA match that we're gonna need both in AOT and ANR. So those match pieces actually got sort of stuck in cash fund B.
Right.
There's a distinction that they weren't actually appropriated, they were reserved, which is a different thing, but those essentially fell in that approach, sorry.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think it's important. I believe those are opportunities, not obligations.
The
IIJA.
Yeah,
So that's money that we don't wanna leave on the table, federal money that will be available.
right, correct. Those are our estimates, and I say estimates really that like, I know ANR very well because they're in my portfolio. I'm not as familiar with AOT, but like they have from the feds clear guidelines how that program will unfold, what the
Yes.
opportunities are. And they're looking and they said, whoa, there's a ton of money.
Yes,
Right.
The number that the governor's often cited is, well, at least 4 federal dollars to 1 state dollar.
Yes.
With ANR, the average is actually closer to 12.
Right,
So
right,
there's 12 federal dollars for every, because some of the programs don't require any state match, some of them are 90-10, it varies.
Right.
So it's a really, really good opportunity to draw down
It
federal
would-
funds.
be so foolish to not have that money there, so it's opportunity.
Absolutely agree.
That's the second time.
It happens, I'm for good government.
Welcome to the Republican Party.
I think.
Nonpartisan good government is a fine thing.
I think there are things we can all agree on. for
Yes.
sure, especially in this vein. So, Mr. Chair, your point about cash fund B, this year, one thing to Senator Harrison's point, we are very glad that those reserves were established. We are proposing to start using them to draw down some of those funds. AOT is unreserving, maybe the bulk of their, what was reserved for them. ANR is on a slightly different schedule. They won't actually need to start unreserving until next capital bill cycle, just the way the timing is with the feds, and they could speak quite a bit more to that. But basically, we're really glad those are there. They should stay there.
Okay, so you're fine with that fund?
We're fine. We're accepting how things shook out and that exists. We are not proposing any uses for it, aside from we're happy that those reserves are there. That the appropriations that were made in FY 24 from that fund, great, let them happen.
Okay.
Hopefully, please don't take anything back out, because there are some critical capital projects. That's if you flip the next page here in the cash fund crosswalk section. The final two, they're sort of spreadsheet pages, and apologies, they're a little smaller. This really showed, all right, so the leftmost column shows the sub accounts, so sub account A versus sub account B. And this is really a tool that I put together to try to help community members just track, okay, of all the various cash fund uses and appropriations made last year, which ones were out of sub account A? Did they live in Act 69, the capital bill? Did they live on the next page in Act 78?
Okay,
So
there we go, okay.
sections are.
Yeah.
So this is meant to be a tool to help you all kind of crosswalk and say, okay, for instance, look at BGS reuse planning and contingency, top line of Act. So in Act 69, it was authorized in section 18C1 and then the FY 25 piece in 18D1, right? Those are the authorizations. In the big bill, the first part of it was actually appropriated in section B1105A1. And then notably, right, there was nothing appropriated for FY 25 because that is part of the $10 million of projects that weren't funded. So this is really meant to just be an instructive tool. I've passed this along to JFO as well. And then on either sheet, on the right-hand side, you see Act 69 BAA. That gives what we're proposing. You can see, again, it's just like the other spreadsheet. Anything that's new is highlighted in yellow. That's additional spending authority. And there's some minimal reorganization of sections just based on the fact that sub-accounts got all mixed up in the blender, I think, last year. And so if you're reading through the legislation, you're looking at sub-account A, then there's some B sub-account things, and then there's A again, so it's pretty difficult to follow. So we reorganized the whole section just to say, okay, here's all the sub-account A, these, and then here's B, et cetera, et cetera.
It's a good idea.
So that's, well, and I'll flag that the current House BAA construct rejected the striking of the cash fund appropriations, which was, this was sort of a two-parter, right? We had to, in the FY 24 BAA, recommend removing these B1105 numbers from last year's bill. And then here in the capital BAA, we recommend putting them in the capital bill. So current law as passed by the House did not accept that proposal. So they're carrying those, and they're saying, nope, we're gonna leave them in the Act 78. So that's if this committee were to feel strongly about that, that's something to make known, I think, to your Senate counterparts and to push back against that.
Questions, committee? I think, that was, for me, very helpful.
Me too.
Yes, I agree.
Very helpful.
Yes.
I think now, I don't think that I could have gone down through line item, and line item, and line item without understanding what we just heard. I know I could. So it was very helpful. Yep. Very, very, very helpful.
Well, I really appreciate the committee's time. I know it's sort of, you know.
We appreciate your time because I think that, again, it was really, really hard to really get psyched for our work without really fully understanding what our work was.
Sure.
And I think that was some clarity that you brought forth. And, yeah, I appreciate it.
Well,
Good.
acknowledging that it's a lot of content, and if this committee is anything like I am, it takes sometimes several times to hear the same thing, and so I'm
What was wrong with me?
always available and happy to come back, or happy to speak with individual members one-on-one if you have ongoing questions. I think I'm on the agenda for.
You are Thursday.
Is that still helpful?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yep, we're gonna have some more questions and, we'll be able to, dive in a little bit deeper and get some more explanations and, yeah,
Great.
appreciate that very much.
I will be here.
Okay.
All right. Well, thanks for your time.